Welcome to the SBI Podcast, offering CEOs, sales and marketing leaders ideas to make the number.
Welcome SBI Podcast listeners and video podcast viewers. My name is Eric Estrella, and here's my good buddy and colleague, Dan Perry. We are with SBI, a sales and marketing consultancy dedicated to helping you make your number. On this web show and audio podcast, we will feature topics and tutorials that will help you make your number. By tuning in, you can leverage emerging best practices and receive how-to instruction on some of the most prevalent go-to-market problems that exist in today's complex selling world.
Eric, we get a lot of questions around this as well, too. Questions like, did you ever wonder why some companies make their number every year and some struggle with consistent performance? Companies come to us every day and ask for help to get more consistency in making their number, but most don't even know where to start. And it starts with strategic alignment. But let's first define strategic alignment. Strategic alignment begins with a clear understanding of the corporate strategy, followed by a grasp of the interdependencies among the various functional strategies. To truly be strategically aligned, you must link these internal strategies with external market conditions. And Eric's proven to be difficult. And we found that 91% of companies are misaligned. And the main reason is the realization that companies really have tactics masquerading as strategy. This results in a lot of waste, or as we define it as thrashing. Tons of work with little productivity gains.
Yep, so obviously if it was easy, everybody would do it.
Yep.
Hence, that's why only 9% actually get there. So on today's show, we're going to discuss the importance of market research and how to conduct it in your organization. Let's start with simple definition, right? So market research provides a deep understanding of the markets, accounts, buyers, and users that you or your organization sells to, right? It helps you differentiate your strategy from your competition, prioritize your accounts, align your strategy with buyer needs, and address user problems with your products. As a result, you can bring your strategy into alignment with the external market.
Yeah. If you don't start with the market, then you're really already out of alignment. The process starts with market research. The market will inform your corporate strategy, and your corporate strategy will inform your functional strategies. This visual purposely depicts the process. It links in a chain. Because if one of those links is faulty or doesn't even exist, then the chain breaks, as does the alignment of your strategies.
Yep, so it's the first link in the chain, right?
Yep.
So before you get into corporate and the remaining functional strategies. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with defining the questions that you need to be answered in your market research. You need to start with that objective, right? So you have to answer this. What are the inputs you need to develop your corporate, product, marketing, sales, and talent strategy? Remember, strategy is the allocation of people, time, and money. So if you start there, you know what the objectives of your market research are.
Yeah, sounds good, Eric. So let's go into those four main points of market research. And this is really on the how we conduct market research. So there's four phases, and you'll see on screen a graphic that shows these four phases. The first phase is market segmentation. And this is defined as the broad target market into subsets of buyers who have common needs, priorities, and solution options. Second, Eric, is account segmentation. Understand which accounts in your market are going to generate the most revenue over the shortest period of time. Buyer segmentation is the third phase of market research. Understand how buyers in your accounts make purchase decisions. And then finally, at the core, right, is user segmentation, mostly skipped by companies now. The user segmentation, understand the market problems that exist for users in your accounts.
Yeah, and I love the purposeful distinction between buyer and user segmentation, right? Because there's a big difference there.
They're huge.
Yeah, so if I'm thinking about, again, the objectives on what I need to obtain from our market research, I should start with the market itself, right? If I'm trying to segment the market, I should be answering the following questions. Right? So how big is our market and what is the growth rate? Seems fairly obvious, right? You're understanding what the total potential is.
And I've noticed most companies typically have some sort of data on this.
Yeah, and a lot of it can be obtained from third-party companies and secondary research like IDC, Gartner, so on and so forth. We'll get to that here in a second. But just knowing what the size of the sandbox is that you're going to be playing in is obviously crucial. So what industry trends are unfolding in our market, right? We talked before in a previous show about BlackBerry, RIM, not necessarily understanding the market conditions and how those were changing, right? That was an industry trend on smartphones, right? So that's something that they should have been identified via market research.
Yep.
So what are the needs of the market and how are they changing? Similar to the trends, right? So what are the needs? And it's a constant ear to the ground. We'll talk about a little bit about in later in the show about why you should do this iteratively and constantly over the period of time. So what should our go-to-market strategy be for each product or solution? The key word there is each, right? So we may actually have a different go-to-market strategy for two different products. Why? Because they're likely two different user problems, two different buyers, or buyer decision teams, if you will.
Eric, what is a go-to-market strategy? That name gets thrown around all the time. So let's define what go-to-market means.
Yeah, in a very simple term, right? It's just how we create demand and sell our solutions, right? So there are certain products that you might have a freemium type of model, right? So if you're a software product, download it, try it for free, and then buy a subscription later on. If you're selling a big enterprise product or solution, it's likely not going to work on a freemium basis. So you're selling it and creating demand to a certain buyer set.
Yep. So market research, it's critical. You can't really develop a go-to-market without the market research.
Correct. Yeah. If you don't know how your buyers buy or what user problems you're identifying, then that's obviously
So I challenge everybody, our audience, have you done market research before you figure out your go-to-market? And I bet some of you haven't.
Yeah, a go-to-market, like literally a go-to-market strategy could be not to have a sales force. On that freemium model, why would you have a sales force? You don't need them, right? It's a marketing strategy. It's a product strategy.
Yep.
Right? So how do my competitors go to market? Seems fairly straightforward, right? When we talk about how do they win on product? Do they win on price? Do they win on customer intimacy? What we don't want to do is be the same, right? We don't want to be me too. So knowing how they go to market is crucial as part of market research. What are our competitive strengths and weaknesses? Fairly obvious, right? What are our opportunities, threats in the market? Again, fairly obvious. Understanding what it is how we can go and win. And for our solution, what are the life cycle stages of adoption of our buyers and users?
So talk to me about that. Life cycle stages of adoption. What does that mean?
Yep. So when I think about it from a product context, right, you think of Jeffrey Morris crossing the chasm. You have early adopters. You have people that have actually had late adoption. Where's your product sit within that, right? Is it a brand new solution that nobody knows about and you're actually having to have an evangelical marketing and sales process, or is it something that could be turn and burn off the shelves from like an inside sales model, right? So knowing and understanding where you're plotting on that is absolutely crucial.
It's a big word for you, evangelica. Yeah, that's good.
Every once in a while I bust them out.
Exactly. So. All right. So Eric, let's move on to accounts within the market. When doing that, your objective should be to answer the following questions: what's our ideal customer profile? And what defines this ideal customer and prospect? And we answer that in a segment as well, as I mentioned earlier. That's a critical question and can have ramifications throughout your entire strategy.
Yeah, I'd argue if you don't have this clearly defined, and when I mean defined, it's not just hey, I know it, it's just sitting here up here in tribal knowledge, right? Is it actually written down? Is it documented? And is there math behind it, right? So where's the science? How do you know it's ideal if you haven't actually done the exercise of what we call account segmentation and prioritization?
So to take that further, right? Next question I would ask is, how does each customer prospect score relative to the ideal customer profile? This would mean then you actually have it written down, an equation behind that, and then somewhere you house that data, like a CRM tool, right, that can be used for day-to-day operations.
Yep, totally agree.
Right, so that's a score. Next one that we have here is, what's the potential spend for each ideal prospect or customer? So potential spend is huge too, right? That goes into not only we score to the ICP, but what's the spend to the ICP?
Yeah, I totally agree. So if you think about it in simplest terms, right? If I have an account that looks and smells and tastes like a very, very good customer and the prospect is similar, right? Shouldn't we expect to get something comparable from that type of prospect? The answer is likely yes. Yeah. But again, there's math and science that goes beneath that.
Yeah, so that's all in the episode that we have about ideal customer profile. You should check this out because we answer all these questions in here. To move along, what's the cost to acquire each customer? And then what's the lifetime value of each customer? Again, you want a lower cost to acquire, a higher lifetime value. Makes sense. What's the ratio between those two? And we do answer that question in another episode. That's important, and market resource answers these questions for you or gives you the information and the data to answer these questions. And finally, what's the propensity to buy for each prospect and customers? What's the likelihood of them buying with us versus buying something else?
Yep, totally agree.
Right? So as you can see, this is heavily quant focused and not easy to do, but it is 100% mandatory when conducting market research. And we've seen companies not do this. They take a break. They kind of really actually don't even do it fully to the extent it should be done. And then you get bad data. And what does bad data lead to, Eric?
Bad output.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, thanks, Dan. So we're going to take a quick commercial break, but stick around because when we come back, we're going to show you what the best methods are to gather insights for each one of these phases that we just talked about.
Each day, you receive hundreds of emails, tons of text messages, countless telephone calls, and sit in too many meetings. How do you find ideas to make the number with all this noise? The SBI blog filters all this nonsense for you and presents only first-rate ideas to make the number. Simplify your life. Subscribe to one blog and read the best content. Go to salesbenchmarkindex.com and subscribe today.
Welcome back. I'm Eric Estrella, and this is my buddy Dan Perry. We're with SBI. Today, we're trying to help you make your 2016 number by demonstrating how to develop a market research methodology. Before the break, we discussed the 4 phases that need answering. In this segment, we will show you how and what methods you should conduct to gather that intelligence.
Yep. So, Eric, the first step in the process is to identify someone who's accountable to the process. Remember, if it's everybody's responsibility or accountability, then no one owns it. And in addition, you can't rely solely on secondary research from research firms such as Forrester, Gardner, and IDC. Fantastic sources of data, provide a lot of insight on the market, but you cannot hang your entire market research process on those single data points. You need to be more specific to your customers, prospects, etc. And this is what we call primary research. Now, accountability, I want to come back to that, right?
Yep.
You got to have someone in your company who owns the market research. Who in a company, Eric, would you give an example or best practice that would do this?
Yeah, I think larger companies have what you would call a chief strategy officer that typically owns something like this. Smaller companies, you might have your CMO, VP of marketing, own market research. To us, it's somewhat irrelevant. We don't really care as long as it actually gets done and somebody is responsible and accountable, responsible for conducting it, accountable ensuring that it actually gets happening.
Yeah. So, and what's interesting though is you can't cheat. So you can't just do secondary research, right? You've in Gardner and IDC, you got to do the primary research. And what I found is that those organizations, they cheat. They don't actually on a very regular basis do the primary research. And then what happens? End up like BlackBerry.
Yeah, you're completely out of alignment, right?
Yep.
If you're not doing it yourself, then you don't know. So perfect segue, Dan. Thank you. So what else should you be doing, right? So you should be doing customer, prospect, employee, and competitive research, right? So I said a lot there. We're going to show you how to do that here in a second, right? So what programs should you have in place to ensure alignment in the market, right? These may seem simple, but according to SBI's research, only 9% of companies have achieved full alignment internally and to the market, right? Most companies are not fully aligned, and that alignment gap is typically to the market as well.
Got it. So let's take each one of those that you mentioned, right? Customer, prospect, employee, and competitive. It's customer research. So most companies have some type of customer sat metrics, such as Net Promoter Score, NPS, and that's great. But what about customer interviews with the buyers and users in the accounts? Customer advisory boards are also effective sources of data intelligence. Executive mapping on your key accounts will also help you gather good good customer research. Sharing of product roadmaps and OEM relationships, sales interactions, or maybe a dialogue, day in the life of with a sales professional.
So what's that? What's a day in the life of?
Yeah, that's really spending time in the field with a sales professional from morning to late afternoon or evening. And why is that important? Selling time is just as important sometimes as non-selling time. And so obviously when we see a customer at selling time, we get great market data, market research from that. But we also, during non-selling time, learn the idiosyncrasies of a sales rep. What does this mean is that what are they doing every single day? What are they learning in the market? How are they prospecting? What's working and not working? That's an example of great market research and customer research as well too.
Yeah, so in the context of what it is that we're talking about, which is customer and prospect research, we can see how those guys are interacting, right? How the customers and prospects are responding to the things that our sales organization is doing, the messaging, the products, so on and so forth. So those insights are invaluable.
They are invaluable. Another way to do this is buyer and user persona interviews. Now, a persona is a representation of a buyer, right? And these interviews will address we'll go to these in a second, right? But the list can go on. So let's not lose sight of the goal here, right? User, buyer, and account segmentation. Obtaining insights that will allow us to segment each within the markets we play in is paramount.
Yep. So you covered customer segmentation. Yep. So I'm going to get into a little bit more detail on the prospect research.
Okay.
Right. So what's one of the first methods? Win-loss interviews. It's a great source of data. Why? Because you really find out more about your alignment to the market there than you will anywhere else. Right. If you think about it, right? So what you're trying not to do is have a conversation on features and benefits of your product. It's really about identifying where the alignment resides. So are we solving the prospects' problems, right? If we lost a deal, that's a pretty good indication that we fell down somewhere, right? So it's identifying what that looks like. So you should be asking questions about the buyer, in these different stages of his or her buying process, and then map those to your marketing and sales processes. Did we not truly understand the buyers of the solution, or better yet, the entire buying decision team, right? Recent research has come out to say buying decision teams are about 5.4 people now. That's pretty high.
Yeah, and we learned from this research as well too that consensus building is critical. So that it's a different topic, right? But you learn from this prospect research on how your salespeople can change the way they're quote unquote selling to the buying process by really understanding the prospect.
Right. So, and that post-mortem win-loss interview is critical, especially on the losses, right?
Yep.
So, second method you'd be thinking about would be social listening. So are you hanging out, so to speak, on social media where your customers and prospects are hanging out, right? What are they saying? What industry forums do they belong to? Are they in LinkedIn groups? These are the things that the marketing team or somebody that's accountable for market research should or could be doing, right? Because it's user problems, remember.
One of our recent customers did some social listening, and they found out that Instagram is becoming more prevalent in their business, where they're now posting pictures and attracting people to their business through active demand. That's an example that they'd never used just 6 months ago.
So why would I care about that? So what would I change as a result of finding that out?
Yeah, so what you want to change is the way your salespeople prospect. And by incorporating maybe Instagram, if it's relevant, into your social reach programs, you can increase the number of active leads that come into you, because Instagram is definitely a source that you pull in leads. So it's active demand. It's an awareness type of technique, and that'll increase the number of hopefully qualified leads as well too.
Yeah. So if I think from an alignment standpoint on marketing, right? If I look at my marketing budget and I say, all right, hey, Instagram is hot for us right now, yet I have $0 in my social media marketing budget. What do I need to do? Right? Allocation of people, time, and money. I need to get dollars into that bucket, right? And then now you actually have proof that is a valuable way to spend those dollars.
And that's why you got to continuously do this market research. You can't lay off this thing.
Totally.
Yeah.
So Dan, we talked about customer and prospect research, and you mentioned dialos, right? So sales interactions. Your sales reps are going on let's call it 10 calls per week, right? So how are you obtaining insights from customers and prospects there? There's potentially thousands of interactions which you can then incorporate into your market research process, right? Again, buyer, user, persona interviews are one of the best ways to stay aligned. Dan, can you explain to us what a persona is?
Yeah, I can. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but straightforward is a representation of the buyers and users you interact with within the accounts in your market. By developing a persona, you'll be able to better understand your buyers' objectives, obstacles, challenges, strategic initiatives, key performance indicators, etc., right? You will also develop what we call a buyer process map. This is the journey that your buyer goes through when making buying decisions.
Can you give us a little bit more detail there?
Yeah, of course. These are the stages the buyer goes through. Now, these stages typically have exit criteria, or sometimes called verifiable outcomes. So what is this exit criteria? It's something that the buyer demonstrates to let you know that he or she is ready for the next stage in the process. In addition to that, it would include what are called micro questions. So what are those? They are the questions that your buyer is asking themselves throughout and in every stage of the buying journey. It's almost, Eric, like they're asking questions in their head.
Okay, so what would be examples of those, right? I'm sure our audience would like to know what that is.
Let's say your buyer is a CIO, Chief Information Officer, right? And the buyer is buying technology and is what we call in the stimulated stage, which is an early stage of a buying journey. What types of questions would they be asking you? Well, since they aren't stimulated, usually some type of trigger event has happened. So they're probably asking questions like, how do I prevent another data breach? What are the best practices for security protocol? How will this affect me, and should I care? Those are questions that in the CIO's head is asking themselves. That's great buyer insight because you can really use that.
Well, how do you use it?
Number of different ways, right? You can actually use it through understanding how to market to the buyer. So if you start answering the questions that CIO is asking themselves through content, whether that's marketing and or your salespeople, early stage buying, that'll be able then to what? Position your services or solution in a much more formidable way and be able to influence early stage buying and solutioning.
Perfect. Yeah, if I think about it, right, so a lot of companies come up against do nothing versus losing to their competitors a lot, right? So if you're in those early stages and you understand what the buyer is thinking and you're actually, developing the fact that, okay, I need to solve their problem, and they need to say, I need to solve my problem, right? And I can't do it by doing it myself, then you're halfway through the battle.
Well, look at the product, right? The product roadmap could include answers to those questions as well too. Sure. And can the product solve answer those questions, right? And if they can do that, then you can really go all the way through marketing, sales, and then eventually your talent strategy. If you think about corporate strategy alignment.
Cool. All right, so Dan, for our audience, by creating buyer personas and buyer process maps, you're answering the following questions, which are critical to conducting market research, right? Who are our buyers, right? Who makes a decision when buying our solution? What do our buyers care about, right? We kind of talked about the objectives, obstacles, challenges, what keeps them up at night, how they're measured. They care about how they're measured, right? It's an outward-in view on the market, right? How do our buyers make purchase decisions? So you outlined a BPM for us, a buyer process map. That's how they make their decisions, right? And what do our buyers value when engaging with our team? Again, this is now saying, okay, well, how can I be different, right? How do I know them better than they know themselves? And lastly, what must our team be best in class in to succeed in our industry, right? So again, we understand them better than they understand themselves.
I think that last sentence is the key.
Yeah.
Yep. Got to understand them better than they understand themselves.
So you talked a little bit about user personas, and you talked about product, right? So tell me how product and user personas, how are user personas different than buyer personas? And then how does the product integrate with these user personas?
Yeah. So user personas are very similar, but the obvious distinction is that the buyer persona is typically part of the buying decision team that makes a purchase decision for your product or solution. The user is the individual that will directly benefit or actually use the product or solution. Common sense, right? Essentially, your product solution solves the market problems that the user persona experiences every day. And the key delineation, by creating the user persona, you are answering the following questions, just like the buyers. Who are our users? What are the users trying to get done? Solve what problem they're trying to solve. What prevents our users from completing their job? What alternative solutions exist for users to address their needs? What do our users value when engaging with our team? What must our products be best in class to succeed in our industry?
Right, so let me if I just connect this to, right? So a user has the market problem, right? And our product should be, solving that market problem. Because if one doesn't exist, those users don't exist, then we don't really even have a product.
Now you asked about product, right? And you just mentioned this. So that's where I think that the product team really can value more than even buyer persona, user personas.
And so I guarantee this, and most of our audience probably don't have the product team creating user personas today, right? Which they really should be doing. So that's certainly a best practice.
Absolutely.
Okay. It's time for another short commercial break. But don't go anywhere, because on the other side of this break, we're going to talk about incorporating competitive intelligence and employee feedback into your market research. So don't go away.
You are watching SBI TV. This is a monthly web TV show featuring guests just like you, executives trying to grow their revenues. Each month, you can peek behind the scenes and watch your peers discuss their strategies for how they make their numbers. You are not going to want to miss this.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Eric Estrella. This is my buddy Dan Perry right here. We're with SBI. Today, we're trying to help you make your 2016 number by demonstrating how to align your corporate and functional strategies to the market by conducting primary market research. So before the break, we walked through how you would conduct research within your customer and prospect base. The other lens you should be looking at are in the competitive lens and the employee lens.
All right, Eric, so let's discuss employee feedback. Why the employees? Technically, they are internal resources, but often you will find many have been in your industry for a number of years. Many have likely worked for a competitor. So you can obtain market insights and competitive intelligence, of course ethically, right? By tapping into your employees' knowledge. They may have worked in markets you are trying to penetrate. But don't discount employees that have worked in other industries that could implement emerging best practices into your company. So an example would be an employee that worked for a SaaS technology, software as a service, that has suggestions on how to optimize a customer engagement in a services company, or maybe vice versa, right? The point is, you will often find yourself conducting emerging best practices if you are doing something new or different. So there are multiple ways of obtaining feedback. We talked about surveys, interviews, team huddles, dialogues, discussions, focus groups. The key takeaway is that you look internally to your employees to obtain market feedback as well.
So let me give you a quick example. So one of the best companies I've ever seen when obtaining market feedback asks 3 very simple questions. What do you start, stop, and keep doing as an organization? Right? So you'll find that just by asking those very easy, open-ended questions, you'll get an enormous amount of feedback that is relevant to your organization staying in alignment with the market.
Yeah, it's pretty impactful.
Absolutely. So last but not least is competitive intelligence, right? The reasons are obvious. So what are their strategies? How do they win? Do they win on product, customer, experience, on price, right? So the list goes on. So what are the methods to actually do this, right? So conduct mystery shops. So this will give you insight on competitors on how they market and sell.
Now, wait a minute now. Time out.
Yep.
I get the fact of a mystery shop, right? But how would you do this? How would you pull this off? Because it seems complex. That's why it probably doesn't happen a lot.
Yeah, it could be as simple as just a form fill on the website, right? How do they market to you? What does their nurture path look like? different things like that. Obviously, we're not going to do anything unethical, but you can just get public information from your competitors and just derive insights from it, right?
Yeah. So in a sense, one of the ways to do this is go on a website form fill, right, and see what kind of response you get.
Totally. Who calls you back, right? So think about that. What content do they give you? Who calls you back? How quick do they call you back? Do they shoot you an email? You could find a lot about information about your competitors just by getting very simple data points just like that.
Yeah, it's pretty impactful.
Right. Yep. So we talked earlier about win-loss interviews and the importance of each, right? So understanding why a buyer, may have chosen your competitive solution is critical, right? Secondary market research firms such as Gartner, IDC, Forrester, we talked a little bit about those early on. They have a wealth of information about your competitors. That's publicly held information that is not unethical to obtain, right? And then lastly is intel from employees and partners. Again, only if done ethically. So let me ask you this question, Dan. So we kind of talked about it a little bit earlier. How often should we be conducting market research?
We mentioned it consistently.
Yeah.
Right? It's absolutely critical that you do this on a regular cadence, and cadence really means a rhythm to it.
Right. So let me just think about this. So market research is not an event, right?
No.
So it should just be the methodology that you should follow is constant, a constant ear to the ground, because that contiguous feedback loop is going to be critical for you to understand this, right? Think about your buyer and user personas. How often are you doing those interviews, right? It should be monthly, at least. Right? Because how would you know if your buyers or users are changing if you're not constantly engaging with them?
Eric, it made me think about when we started this conversation, right? Have someone own it. Who's accountable for it. And if you do that, then in their job description, they have to go ahead and conduct market research on a regular basis.
Yep.
So remember the goal, alignment to the market that starts with the market research phase. By conducting the different research methods, you can effectively achieve user, buyer, account, and market segmentation. By customer research, to ensure your strategy is aligned to your customers, prospect research, to ensure your strategy is aligned to your prospects, employee research, to ensure your employees are aligned to your strategy and the market, that's critical, and nevertheless, competitive research, right? To ensure your strategy is different than your competitors.
Yep. So Dan, unfortunately, we are out of time on today's episode, but we would like to thank you, our viewers, for tuning in. If you enjoyed this show, I suggest you subscribe to SBI TV at salesbenchmarkindex.com/TV, or you can find us on our SBI YouTube channel. We have some outstanding content coming in future episodes that you will not want to miss. So until then, Dan and I wish you the best of luck as you try to make your number.
This has been the SBI Podcast. For more information on SBI services, case studies, the SBI team and how we work, or to subscribe to our other offerings, please visit us at salesbenchmarkindex.com.